What is the Gospel of Thomas and why is it not in the Bible? The answer may surprise you in this episode of the Accessible Faith Project. Hi there, I'm John, and welcome to the Accessible Faith Project. If you're new here and looking for insights into the Bible, faith, and history in ways that engage your brain regardless of your faith stance, then please hit subscribe and that little bell icon so you can be notified anytime I upload a new video. This video may raise some other questions that you might want me to address in an upcoming video. Please feel free to share those in the comments section below. Around the same time that the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1945, there was another lesser-known archaeological discovery in Egypt that has had an even greater impact on the study of early Christianity. It was a collection of written works, mostly written in the Coptic language, that was found by a farmer near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. It took a few years for the manuscripts to find their way into the hands of scholars, but their significance cannot be downplayed. In all, 13 leather-bound codices were found filled with some 1,000 papyrus pages. Once these were translated, there were some 52 distinct works identified, including what appeared to be a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus. This would be the first complete version of a text that was known as the Gospel of Thomas. Now, before I get too far, there's a couple of things that I need to state up front. This discovery was and is a very significant one for biblical scholars, but it has also generated some conspiracy theories not unlike the ones floating around the Dead Sea Scrolls. Unfortunately, these theories get traction in the absence of good, well-researched information. When there is a discovery like this, researchers and scholars need to be methodical in their approach, and that takes time for that information to be processed, and hypotheses tested before a consensus can be made. Unfortunately, conspiracy theories don't have this restriction and can spring up quickly in that time gap. So what you need to know is that there are no conspiracies from the Vatican to suppress or hide the Gospel of Thomas at any point in its history. The truth is, we have known about the Gospel of Thomas for a very long time, but the 1945 discovery was the first complete version of the work that had been discovered. Prior to that, there were many fragments of documents that were known, and there were written accounts from early Christian writers as early as 200 CE who were aware of it. In light of the find at Nag Hammadi, scholars were able to connect some of them directly to the Gospel of Thomas. So what is the Gospel of Thomas? Beyond the four Gospels found in the Bible, the Gospel of Thomas is one of approximately 15 or so collections of sayings of Jesus or stories about Jesus that were written sometime between the 2nd and 4th centuries of the Common Era. Unlike the four Gospels in the New Testament, the Gospel of Thomas is just a collection of 114 sayings that are attributed to Jesus. It has no narrative flow to it, it has no miracle stories, and no story of the Passion. At best, some of the sayings have a little bit of a setup in them, giving a rudimentary description of a situation where Jesus then delivers a message. As with the other Gospels, we don't know who the writer was. Unlike the other Gospels, however, the very first line actually attributes the recording of the words to Thomas, the disciple of Jesus. Even so, it is highly unlikely to be the case, even if a number of the sayings in this Gospel can be directly tied to Jesus. So when was it written? Well, that's a bit more complicated. The full manuscript that was discovered at Nag Hammadi was written in the Coptic language. This physical copy dates to the middle of the 4th century, but it had been translated possibly from Syriac, but for other fragments that were found in other locations, the language was probably originally Greek. We also know that Hippolytus of Rome and Origen of Alexandria were both aware of the Gospel of Thomas, both having mentioned them and even quoted it from the early 3rd century, a full century before this particular copy was made. By the time the Coptic version was made, it had already undergone several edits and included many sayings that, while attributed to Jesus, reflected a theology and a perspective that didn't exist until at least the middle of the 2nd century. In other words, things that the historical Jesus would have never said. Still, parts of the Gospel of Thomas appear to be contemporary with some of the sayings material that the writers of Mark, Matthew, and Luke all used when composing their respective Gospels. There is also a number of parallel stories and sayings that exist in Thomas that correspond to various parables and sayings found in the biblical Gospels. Where the four Gospels that have become part of the New Testament found a widespread consensus among early Christians, the others did not for various reasons. And how that process happened is really worth a few more videos. But what you do need to know is that there wasn't a group of old men locked in some tower deciding what was in and what was out. That process happened out in the open, not through formal councils, but rather consensus and discussion. And while books like the Gospel of Thomas were used in the early Christian communities, it was not as widespread nor as agreed upon as what eventually formed the New Testament. Not only that, in response to Marcion in the middle of the 2nd century, Christians became a lot more cautious as to what they considered to be authoritative. The Gospel of Thomas, at least in the form that was found in the Nag Hammadi library, was one that reflected a theological perspective that was outside of the evolving Christian consensus. However, the story of what books were included and not included is worth video all on its own. So why is it significant? Still, even if the Gospel of Thomas did not end up in the Bible, it has been a real benefit to biblical scholars. It has helped confirm that collections of sayings of Jesus were in circulation in the early church, and they were independent of miracle stories or stories about the crucifixion. It has also given an insight into why Matthew and Luke were written, as they incorporate sayings that Mark did not appear to have access to. The Gospel of Thomas gives insight both into the early life of the church and how it developed, but also how different branches of Christianity existed and were influenced by other philosophies and ideas that existed at the time. So its value as a historical document is substantial. So why wasn't the Gospel of Thomas included in the Bible? Well, the short answer is it didn't achieve consensus in early Christianity in the same way that the four biblical Gospels did. Additionally, there is enough evidence to suggest that there were substantial variations between the versions that did exist, and it was unclear as to which one should be used. Still, as an archaeological and literary find, the Gospel of Thomas can still be something that can help us better understand the Bible, even if we don't read from it on Sunday mornings or in a devotional time. So if you want to explore questions like this that will expand your horizons and deepen your understanding regardless of your faith stance, then come and join us on this journey by clicking on subscribe and that little bell icon, and you're all set to go. And I'll see you next time on the Accessible Faith Project.